Okay. Are we already live? For the chance that Dan Sparkler is watching this, your bottom. And also, thank you so much. You've been a great help during this tournament, but also beforehand. And also, thank you, Ada. Even though it was stressful prep time, I still enjoyed every single round with you so far. So, now actually going to start my speech. Fucking leftists. They're ruining leftism. What we're going to explain is what you're going to have these kind of like bad criticisms, why you're going to have internal, external, less likely for you to actually get these callouts and get like good people to help in the first place. So I want to first actually characterize what those callouts are. I want to firstly note that inherently within these callouts there is inherent criticism that's saying that you are doing something bad and you're doing something wrong. The problem inherently with this is that oftentimes people don't want to hear this, especially when they're giving up their own free time, their money, to believe something that they are doing is actually correct. So therefore there's already a high like entry burden in this. But also inherently people don't want to feel like they're morally wrong, which means that oftentimes there's an immediate defense mechanism where they're going to say like, no, we don't want this actually. We don't believe that you are correct, because it's easier for you to want to believe that you were correct in the past and you're going to be correct than actually be convinced that you did something bad in the first place. That is why criticism oftentimes has to be very hard to take and why inherently it is hard for you to change. These are inherent burdens, which means it's inherently hard to actually engage with this. Secondly, I also want to note that oftentimes is not as constructive. Yes, sometimes you'll have callouts where you're not having enough women, but I think there's just oftentimes just still structural problems that you have, right? Maybe there aren't actually that many women in the field who are willing to work with because they oftentimes need to have higher payouts that they need to pay for to kind of like get financial independence because they had a lot of structural problems beforehand. Or just the fact that it is very easy to say you're not focusing on like these kind of like rights, but it's like for example black people, but it's oftentimes very hard to deal with these kinds of things. Know that oftentimes there are just multiple layers of structures that exist. It's the police engage with, it's the way the education system engage with, it's kind of like segregation that happens and the kind of like culture that has been then also happening within these neighborhoods and kind of like the fatherlessness within them and that kind of stuff. Trying to then talk about all these issues is inherently quite hard. So then oftentimes it's just easy to just shout, you're not dealing with this enough, but then actually giving constructive feedback, because that's very hard to do in the first place. And also, I just think this is the problem, thirdly. Oftentimes, these are the loudest people. These are the people who are oftentimes most willing to kind of like go for this. No, these oftentimes are people also who are more extreme, because they're willing to put their mouth open, and you are willing to go against these NGOs and that kind of stuff. I think this already is then the problem. They oftentimes are also not going to be representative of most of the community, because they're willing to go against these structures who are oftentimes able to help. Oftentimes, they're also still somewhat relatively privileged, right? It's oftentimes that they're still like, yes, you are a black woman, but they're also oftentimes very rich, is why you feel comfortable that you are going to, need to take this place and you're going to have this right in the first place and you feel comfortable in doing this, which means that you're going to have some intersectionality, but oftentimes not going to be good and oftentimes is going to be more significantly extreme. Philip, go.
What is intersectionality to you in this debate?
Okay, I think there's just going to be a lot of problems inherently with this. I will engage with this at the moment we're going to talk about this. I want to also actually first define liberal NGOs before intersectionality. I think liberal NGOs are NGOs which are talking about liberal rights, right? So these are personal rights. So when it comes to like your right to body or right to free speech, all of these kinds of things, I think that these are not always going to be necessarily very leftist. I think these are more general principles you could talk about, because there are also oftentimes, literally liberal movements in the first place where like the ones that are engaging in votes, liberals being leftism is just only in the US because they just use words wrongly. Okay, now, why are they then going to be significantly less palatable? I think you're overall going to need a clear message, right? From the outside, you can say we're going to need to go, for example, for free speech and that kind of stuff. Here is the problem, right? I get the clarification for Philip. What is intersectionality? Why? Because no one fucking knows it outside of this room. Because intersectionality is highly subjective. It is very academic. It's very hard for people to actually understand what it is overall. And I think, therefore, you just say it's like, it's the different way that structures talk about. It's inherently an abstract thing that you are talking about. It's inherently something that is, you already need to buy into these structures being bad in the first place. For the average individual, you first need to explain these structures are bad already. You don't have this presumption. Many people don't engage with it this way. They want to believe that the state is right because this is what is nice to them. It feels comfortable. And therefore, they're much more likely to do things such as like victim blaming, where I'd say, no, this is your fault. You need to pull yourself by the bootstraps. And you don't get this clear message at the moment you're talking about intersectionality, because it is not palatable for these kind of individuals. But I also think you just need a clear message you're going to go for. But secondly, I also want to note, intersectionality is just inherently linked with especially like academic left-wing kind of like progressive ideas. That means that at the moment that you oftentimes have this right-wing media, which is now going to show this as, you see as like woke NGOs who are going to fire. If you go woke, you go broke, all this kind of stuff. And it is hard to explain. And it is like sometimes language which makes it very like conspiratory or kind of like Illuminati-like. It's easy to kind of like pick this on and therefore get this like backlash on this. I think again, when you're doing more generic stuff, where you're saying, no, we're making free rights for everyone. So also for the poor white trash who are not actually getting the help that they deserve. You're much more likely to also have these like rich, like these right-wing people, ascendant people wanting to engage this. But thirdly, right, I also think it's just what do you identify with the most, right? Inherently to intersectionality is there are many intersections. It is just not being just like a black woman. It's also being a black queer woman. It's also to be queer and black. All all of these things, which means inherently there are so many groups that you are talking about. And when you need to discuss all of these, one, the criticism never fades away. So therefore, you're always going to have like problems where people feel like they're continuously being attacked, even if they're trying their best. But also, I just think, secondly, right, at the moment you are going to need to talk about all these intersections, most people then don't feel like they get engaged with, because inherently these are only a small subset of this. That is why, for example, it is easier for you as a woman to engage with abortion rights when you feel it is more general and it is about womanhood, rather than it is also specifically about black women and all of this kind of stuff. I think that overall, what does this mean? Firstly, externally, you're less likely to get things such as donations, because I think it is significantly less palatable for individuals to engage with it, and you get more of this like backlash that we're talking about. But I think internally, people are also less willing to work with you in the first place, right? I think the fact that you are now feeling that you are being criticized within your own movement, and you can never do it right, because there's always going to be a new intersection which is going to pop off, means you're less willing to do this. Most likely, you're going to then go for other kind of stuff. I think I want to say like, and also I want to note, lastly, I think it's just that the fact that all of these NGOs don't need to deal with everything. It is fine for you to focus on free speech and do this more general. It is fine for them to be a like black NGO who focuses about black issues and that kind of stuff. I think these are things that are able to exist. We're able to talk about their specific issues. And I think that means that it is unclear why every NGO needs to be this way. If there's a PY from opening, go.
Yeah, do you think that NGOs are going to cede to every criticism that they're given?
Look, I think the problem is either you concede, right? And I think that the problem then is that you now need to make a next concession, or you don't concede, but then also pisses off these people who are going to talk about this. So I think that you're a lose-lose situation, because you're going to lose the people who are unwilling to make this concession and don't want to feel like harassed and like criticized and all that kind of stuff, or you just are going to have the problem where there's people who are feel like, I already got a bit, we should get significantly more, and they get used to this. They get used to this idea that you're going to give in, means that these people are willing to give up. I think what the problem is, you're going to get significantly more infighting. I think this is just a problem where you have just like, when you are just getting a bit more annoyed that when you're trying your best, someone else is criticizing you, you are just less likely to help that NGO. You're just less likely to want to go there and do your volunteer work and do all of this kind of stuff, but you're also less likely to actually want to engage this. I think it's therefore very hard for them to talk about how they're going to do this well. Not only because there are all of these structural problems, but I also think just solving these things are just inherently hard. I think focusing on more general issues about free speech, calling out police in general, calling out news agents in general, is something that's easier than talk about specific black issues, because oftentimes, again, these are multiple structures that you're dealing with. But also having these experts are just hard. If you are already focusing on free speech as an NGO, you oftentimes are not well versed in black kind of things. But also the problem is, it's about not just black things, it's also about queer people. It's all about this stuff, which means it's just going to be very hard to do this well. And you're also going to have conflicts. Maybe sometimes you need to focus on black rights, but then can't do it for queer rights, which means you're already going to have this infighting as well inherently. Therefore, vote OG.
That Piotr is so confused about what intersectionality is, I think is good evidence that actually there just isn't much awareness of what intersectionality needs to be and what it can be. Because, yes, people think of intersectionality as this maybe academic concept, this high in the clouds concept. But actually, when explained, it is just quite simple. So you might not know what intersectionality is, but it is this criticism specifically that makes you think, oh, intersectionality is real, and in fact, it's quite simple. It's the idea, in some cases, that identity is just more than the sum of its parts, that a black queer person has distinct experiences from both black people and queer people. Or it's this idea that multiple movements can also have intersection, as in that some movements about abortion rights should also consider the race issues in certain places. The characterization that I think is really important here is that currently liberal NGOs lack any amount of intersectionality and get sort of tunnel vision on one issue in ways that can be damaging. And then I'll give you the impacts about why criticism actually helps this problem, as we call it. First, let's talk about who these liberal NGOs actually are. The first thing that I'm going to mention is that probably they're often run by quite privileged people. There are a few reasons for this. The first reason is that there's just quite strong opportunity cost to working for a non-governmental organization that is almost always a non-profit. As in, you're not going to get paid a ton of money if you work for the ACLU, but maybe you get a little bit of prestige. So, if you don't have the financial resources to make that really strong trade-off, it means that you just don't have the opportunity to do so. But second on this running by privileged people, it's also that oftentimes working for an NGO is a career transition after success. So an individual who's like a really talented lawyer might go to the ACLU or the NAACP after their career as a lawyer to give back to their community, so therefore they've already had success in a field, which means they're more likely to be like old white male. We've had this kind of conversation before. But alongside being run by privileged people, who are therefore blind to what intersectionality could or needs to be, as in they aren't actually aware of how specifically their issue might interact with others, there are also instances where just the actual existence of the NGO in the first place ends up being quite narrow. That is, if you joined this group because you're passionate about this specific issue, it's just very easy to get tunnel vision in this area. As in, every single day, you focus on this one issue. It already was one that was extremely passionate for you, and so therefore it's very easy to develop blind spots about the parts of this issue that you never see, because you're only focused on this one issue. I think the examples here are, first, the ones that we already get in the info slide, that you don't even realize that there aren't that many black people in your office because you've only ever focused on the abortion rights part of it, or maybe that like you actually never even thought that you weren't doing certain types of cases for certain minority groups, because again, your focus was on the much broader picture and on the very narrow objective that you have. The last example I'll give here is that during prep time for this motion, I was like, I have some spec. I worked for an NGO that's fighting for DC statehood, and I thought to myself, what are some of the instances where my office lacked intersectionality? And I couldn't think of any because I'm a white guy and I don't see those types of areas. As in, I just lack the experience to know where the other intersections are. As in, how does DC statehood actually interact with other types of identities? Because I'm focused on one specific thing. Go for it.
Why is Ridan's depression as a Pakistani immigrant linked to a white gay man's depression? Like, can you actually explain the intersectionality?
Intersectionality is about somebody who has multiple identities and faces unique oppression because of that specific intersection. So that looks like maybe a certain type of profession employs lots of black people and employs lots of women, but has a problem where they very rarely hire black women specifically. Because if you only look at the identities in a vacuum and not at their combination, their intersection, if you will, then you miss this problem. This is often just how intersectionality happens. Okay. But how does criticism get to this? And here's where I'll explain where some of the problems are. The first thing is on like very low-level, easy change. Because I don't think that there's an opportunity cost a lot of the time. Sometimes there's just low-hanging, easy, quick fixes, win-wins. That is, in your movement, you didn't realize that your abortion rights group was discriminating against black people in hiring. And when this is pointed out to you through criticism, now you can suddenly correct this. The impact here is quite massive and quite obvious. Now people aren't locked out of jobs they want. Maybe now you find cases for the NAACP, which you didn't before, because you were never thinking about them in the first place. It requires criticism that says, hey, you should think about this other group. And you go, oh my God, I had such tunnel vision that I never even considered that other group. I never considered that specific identity, that specific intersection of identity. It's really easy to fix it now. I'll just like hire more people like that. It takes very little once you realize that you're discriminating against black people in hiring to adjust that in the first place. But the second brand of impacts is just through the criticism itself. That you get some amount of like just catharsis as somebody who recognizes all these problems, who feels unheard that the ACLU, established specifically to protect minority rights in America, isn't protecting your minority rights in America. That makes you feel unheard. They aren't actually valuing you as a person. So just the very act of criticizing, that is like speaking your voice, makes you feel at least somewhat better at it. It's like you can actually have a forum to do this. So I think that criticism just offers some help there. But the criticism is also likely to be heard, at least in some capacity, contrary to what opening government says. That's because liberals have a culture of like wanting to hear it. Also, you're not trying to hurt them. So they say, you'll hear this criticism and you will take it personally and therefore you won't change anything, you won't really respond. But one, I think the culture of the left wing is often that you should accept criticism, especially from minority groups in the first place. But second, you just don't take it personally. As in, you think that the actual institution might be making mistakes, but you, as a worker, aren't. You don't feel responsible for like the hiring inequities because like, we can just fix that. It isn't about me. So you're more likely to hear the criticism, see the catharsis with people who are criticizing. No, yeah, go for it actually.
So as per motion clarification, intersectionality is the belief that all oppression is linked by one main cause, and by tackling them, you have to tackle them all at the same time. I think you have misunderstood what it means.
I think intersectionality can just have multiple applications, right? Like some of the instances are that individual different types of movements actually have intersection. So like fighting for abortion rights also requires fighting for black rights because, like black women are disproportionately affected by abortion bans in the US. So yes, it can be that kind of thing, but it also can be like very clear identity intersections like I just talked about. Again, I just think this is a pretty obvious and common interpretation of intersectionality. And in fact, importantly, one literally given in the info slide, as in you discriminate against a certain type of person in your abortion rights group. Maybe you have a lot of women, but you don't hire a lot of black women. Intersection, identity, I think it all works. Lastly, let's talk about discourse. This is where we're going to deal with the infighting thing from OG. Because I think we're right. They're right. The people will disagree about the direction. But when there are really terrible callouts, they're just very easily corrected. As in, when Twitter leftists say intersectional types of things that are really crazy and obviously so, that like everyone you hire should be a trans black woman, I think that these things are rejected by the community because they're seen as so batshit. I don't think that these types of people have nearly the voice that opening governments say that they do. But importantly, even if they did, they're then met with counter-criticism of people who say, actually, this isn't a good idea. Note what happens then. The existence of this criticism creates discussions about direction, where maybe someone says, we shouldn't be going this direction, we should try something else. So the criticism doesn't necessarily mean that you always transition to a more intersectional approach. Sometimes it means that you have the tough conversations where you say, actually, the trade-off isn't worth it, or it is worth it. We want to focus more broadly because that's more important. We don't want to make this transition. Those types of conversations are really important and happen quite well on our side because there is a culture that actually we want to do the best. These people are like generally well-intentioned, they're working for an NGO. So, with more information, more discussion, they can get access to the kind of thing, and therefore benefit from catharsis, discourse, and change.
Thank you for the speech, and now we invite the DPM to continue this debate. Here.
Okay, I prefer my POIs non-verbally. Pozdrowienia dla mojej mamy. Dziękuję, że oglądasz. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. Let's start with engagement with opening opposition. Firstly, they are saying that NGOs are run by privileged people already. This is fucking lie. Like, people who are privileged don't have any motivation to actually waste their time on working on the NGOs. If you are privileged, you are happy in a society, you are not facing structural oppression, you are not thinking about this problem on a daily basis. That means that you don't have any incentives to waste your money, to waste your time, energy, resources, your free time on working to the NGOs, which is often something that you are not seeing direct effects on really easily, so you are not getting direct benefits from this that easily, and also probably you are getting some backlash from your community and your environment and so on, why you are doing such a controversial stuff, why you are engaging in that and so on. So we think that this group that they are talking about is just not existing. Who are actually engaging in the NGOs are people who feeling this oppression and are people who are actually thinking that these problems are important. Why is that? Because they are experiencing these problems. Most of the people who are joining NGOs that are fighting for a specific minorities' rights or a specific, like, facing the specific oppression are people who are experiencing this oppression. Why is that? Because we are thinking about our own problems. This is how we are just, like, thinking about the world. When something is directly connected to our lives, when we feel a specific harm really often, that is when we want to tackle it, and that is when we want to cope with it. And we don't have mental capacity, time capacity to engage in the problems that are not directly impacting ourselves on a daily basis and spend our lives on it. So that's the first part of this analysis. We think that people in this movement are already a vulnerable group in this debate, and that will be later in my weighing. But secondly, to their case, what is the actual change that they are talking about? Like, we are getting this criticism, and then what? Then what is the impact? I don't really know what is changing on their side when we are just criticizing these people, and now they are aware that they are not hiring, like, enough black women. Are they going to actually, firstly, like, probably they are going to do this if they are going to implement this criticism, they are going to do this at the low effort basic level. That means that you are hiring one black woman and you are like, oh, now we're intersectional, blah, blah, blah. But when we are thinking about the intersectionality and when we are thinking that the experiences are inherently different, that means that to tackle them correctly, we should engage with this in a, like, deeper way. This is like, if you had, like, a tree of, like, identities, like, the core is here, and then you are branching to all of this intersectional stuff. You have to go deeper and deeper to understand all of these forms of oppression, and it's harder and harder for you to actually relate with that and so on. That means that if you are just tackling this on a basic level, you are not really doing anything to understand this oppression, to make other people understand this oppression, and to change anything. So we think that it is getting even worse. Why is that? Firstly, you are washing yourself into saying that you are already doing enough, and also you are melting your message into saying a lot of random stuff about a lot of random things, but not delivering anything in total. That is like, you are doing 7 different weird extensions, but you are not impacting any of it. That is what these movements are actually going to do in their words. You are going to talk about black women on Monday, then you are going to talk about disabled women on Tuesday, and then you are going to talk about poor women on Wednesday, and so on. You are not getting any of this, like all of these problems are getting less attention, less visibility. People are less internalizing that because this is the message that they are not seeing so often, they are not seeing this so in depth, they are not understanding this. And that is the moment when this is all like collapse. Yeah.
When should we criticize these NGOs, if ever?
Like, when should we criticize NGOs if they are not doing good stuff, if they are inefficient, if like, okay, and I think that if the aim of the NGOs is to like provide abortion rights, we should criticize this movement if they are inefficient in providing abortion rights. No, when they are inefficient for fighting for black people equality, because it is not their task. They are different movements that are fighting for their specific problems. Okay, now going to our impacting and why our impacts are actually the most important in this debate. You have two types of impacts. Firstly, you have all of the activists and people who are already engaged in movement being way less motivated. Why is that? Okay, you are feeling less, as I already characterized, people who are engaging with these NGOs are people who are feeling this oppression and people who are feeling this really personal. If you are going to talk about everything, you are going to less relate with these NGOs and feeling less mission to actually work for these NGOs. Knowing the context that you are doing this probably non-profit, you are doing this from your mission, like internal feeling and so on, you are going to do less for this movement because you are not feeling this problem that deeply, you are not feeling that this problem is that important, you are not facing this on a daily basis. That means that you are spending less time of it, you're making less work and so on. Given that these movements are actually like based on the activists and on activist works, they are going to provide less help for people who actually need this. So like people are organizing less protests, you are organizing less efficient campaigns, you are encouraging less people to be in this particular movement. But secondly, you are also feeling lack of your own efficacy in doing all of this stuff. You are constantly criticized. You are not getting motivation because you are feeling like you are never doing enough, like you are always failing, that you are a wrong person because you are not like implementing all of these people and all of the issues that you are not really understanding. So you have less motivation to actually do anything because you are feeling that you are never doing enough. And also, like, we think that people are feeling less safe space of this particular movement and less efficient help. Why is that? Because when this message is making way less clear, that means that you are less relating with this group because now you are just one section of this group, so it is harder to create this bonding effect within these groups. That means that the unique part and the unique opportunity to get to give all of these oppressed people any safe space and any form of help and support that they are actually needed, and we are agreeing that they are discriminated in a society, so probably these NGOs are the only groups that are actually taking care about them. So if we are making this less efficient, then we are making their life just worse because these movements are not providing them help that they should get. This is like if you are going to get help with your abortion or not going to get this help with abortion and so on. We think that this is the deepest impact in the debate, which is impacting like lots of vulnerable people and lots of vulnerable groups for whom these NGOs are the only possibility to get any change. Thanks.
Firstly, a note on POIs before I start my speech. If you POI me using my name, I'm going to kill you. Can I use your timer, please? Thank you. Welcome to Intersectionality.
I am a massively privileged white person. At the same time, I advocate for things like abortion rights. I am under oppression for my abortion rights specifically, but I am still privileged in quite a lot of ways. This is what intersectionality is and what it means. I don't understand why GovBench seems confused on this fact. I can go to another state in order to get an abortion. I probably will not be questioned whenever I ask for pills that will allow me to get an abortion in the United States. It is easy to convince doctors that I am in danger of life and limb because they actually understand what it looks like for me to be dying, but they do not understand what death looks like on a black person's face because they quite simply do not have enough exposure to these kinds of things. But a black woman is not in the NGO that I donate money to. Black women do not participate in the advocacy that I am working towards because it is not recognized that they face different issues under the same umbrella as me. The issue is abortion. The question is how it manifests, and what an NGO needs is understanding of how to implement policy in a way to maximize their efficacy, in a way to benefit everyone who exists under the umbrella of we need abortion rights. That is the question. Let's make this really, really simple. There are places where identity changes the issue. An abortion rights group advocates for abortion rights. Perhaps they post flyers encouraging crossing state lines. Black women struggle to have IDs in the United States. This is just a fact about black women and the way that the government oppresses them in one particular way. Sometimes you are asked for your ID whenever you cross state lines. That means that it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for a black woman to cross state lines in order to get an abortion. This NGO is failing a black woman whenever they do not give information on other alternative strategies. They are failing her, but they don't even recognize that they're failing her because this abortion rights group is made up of activists who look and sound like me, who have experienced my life experiences and have not lived the experience of a black woman. That is why it is crucial and essential for you to have diversity, and why these criticisms are likely to be actually about things that matter, because issues like this exist in literally every NGO, because people who look and sound like me, who have the privileges I've had, who've had the education I have, who have the wealth that I have, are more likely to have the time that they need to invest into these NGOs, or more likely to have the money they need to invest in these NGOs, and so I am just more likely than a black woman to have even tried to enter an NGO space in the first place. What Piotr says to this is that this is not constructive criticism. I'll respond to that quite directly. But first, just a note on constructive criticism. They do not have a pathway to constructive criticism. Opening government tells you that it is bad to criticize this and that you should criticize it whenever it's a problem. It's a problem now. Intersectionality is causing real harm to people's lives. This is when we should criticize it. We do not oppose it necessarily. I think that it's hard to be constructive without awareness of the issues, though. So at the bare minimum, even if the criticism that we're giving is bad criticism, even if it's impossible to hire a woman to work in the NGO that for abortion rights that I personally financially support, even if that's not a possibility because no black women applied for that position, now that they're aware of the fact that they need black women in that position, perhaps they can do things like directly advertising the job posting in black high schools, and maybe they will get someone who has knowledge of this particular thing, and then they are able to solve the issue. But without awareness of the fact that this causes problems for people, they are never going to be able to take the steps to solve this at all. That means that opening government recognizes and concedes that they will never deal with intersectional issues, because they recognize and concede that they do not want to question or criticize intersectionality because they don't understand what it means. Then not understanding what it means is the problem in this debate, and the fact that I can explain it to you is kind of actually insane. I'll take opening.
NGOs want to branch out and not discriminate on either side to get volunteers money. And also help the cases that they get, which include black women, because they also still rise to, for example, abortion rights movements. So you don't actually need this, you just have this already inherently.
No, because the criticism exists because it's a problem, right? I just think that liberals are not crazy, insane people who are like, we're going to criticize things for special reasons because we've decided that we want to be represented. I think that people only criticize issues that matter to them. I think that people only care enough to say that an NGO is doing a bad thing if they actually recognize that it's doing a bad thing. See, Cyrus concedes that some of this is going to be stupid and some of it's going to be extreme, but Cyrus also tells you that the movement is going to quickly respond to this because no one is going to back up this criticism. In order for criticism to reach the critical mass to actually change something like an NGO's hiring practices, they need to be reposted like thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of times on Twitter at the bare minimum. You need lots of people to see this and agree with it and recognize that it's a problem in order to get any practical change, which means that there's an inbuilt security mechanism for why we're only going to get the change that actually matters, which is that people have to agree that this is an important issue in order for it to be an important issue. You cannot just magic in that we're going to force NGOs to change because they're afraid of criticism. I think that NGOs face criticism uniquely all the time. I think they face criticism from all sides. I think they only change whenever they recognize that this could cause them positive issues. If you never solve these issues, you literally completely fail as an NGO, and I think that what opening government defends is never solving these issues. Their best case is probably that you get people feel bad whenever they get criticized, and so they respond to this criticism poorly. Sure, fair enough. I think that it's probably true that some people respond poorly to criticism. I think Cyrus gives you two reasons why people will not respond poorly to criticism, but I'll give you an additional reason why people will not respond poorly to criticism. I think the last reason why people will not respond poorly to criticism is because people understand that not only is this criticism valid, but they start to be replaced, right? If someone does not recognize criticism and they buy out of the NGO as a consequence of this, which I think is the minority of people. I think most people are both used to criticism as a mechanism of liberality and are also likely to blame it on someone other than them because they don't want to be the problem, so there's an incentive for them to blame it on something like the system. But I also just think that these people are fine to lose. I think that these are probably not the most important people in this debate because I think that the people who buy out entirely are the people who are actively pushing policies that are harmful to part of the people they should be defending. These are the people who spend time and resources of the NGO on a policy that is only going to help white women because they've never been asked about how it will help black women and they don't actually know the answer. Let's weigh out our impacts really clearly. Firstly, on discourse, I think that these are tough conversations, but they are completely necessary conversations. I think that there are sometimes only so many resources, so finding out how to prioritize is essential. If being intersectional is effective advocacy, i.e. a good use of resources, it will be implemented. If not, it's going to be rejected. Let's impact out our things. First, the act of criticism in and of itself is cathartic for the people who do the critiquing. I think that this is also really important because when you're not represented by someone who claims to represent you, this is really painful and it makes you feel as though you're not heard and it makes you feel as though you're not seen, or maybe you don't even recognize that you're not heard or not seen. You don't recognize that you're not being supported by a particular rights group. But whenever this criticism happens, you recognize and understand the reason you've never really fully bought into that is because they weren't actually talking about issues that mattered to you. You're not a bad person. You just are a person who wasn't being represented. But secondarily, I think low burden changes just happen, and this is probably good.
Fuck it.
Good luck.
I'll just speak.
Actually, manual doesn't give you the
Yeah.
that's a WEDC, not EUDC.
Whatever. Oh, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening government tells you that the incentives behind these individuals likely to be poor. Why? Even if you have the best incentive, this messaging is going to be unsuccessful, meaning you get no benefits on positive change. Then I'm just going to explain why these institutions are pretty good and generally self-criticize themselves to a decent degree at the status quo. What are these specific left-wing movements going to look like? One, I think they're just a small amount of them. This is just inherently due to criticism of leftism anyway. There are just small amounts of economic capital because businesses aren't really Marxist in the first place, and so they don't really spread around this information and these narratives, and so often the majority of the populace aren't really leftist in the first place. But specifically, these are not people advocating for like tax reform and change, right? These are people who are held by the principle that if it's not done right, it should not be done at all, or if there's something that has been done, it's something that should be done properly. Note this is why you critique them for intersectionality and not advocate for like other things down the line. Like, guys, which reasonable actual leftist that you can name is shit on something like the American civil liberty rights movements, abortion groups. These are people with their head in the sand. Oftentimes liberals want to make who want to make their better way ups, often focus on other things such as shittier NGOs, specifically often attacking and mobilizing against organizations that limit the right of people being able to access these things in the first place, rather than critiquing the ones which attempt to progress the rights towards them. But secondly, I think they're just incredibly uncoordinated and there's no specific head of the movement. These are people who often focus online and they don't have a figurehead. Can you actually name one? Can you name the guy who's shitting on the NCACCP right now? I think these are people who often work individually based on what they see online and how they internalize within movements. This often means the lack of narrative messaging is oftentimes just very incredibly confused and not often located towards a specific thing. This means any criticism you actually want to go towards often comes from very different viewpoints based on different political cycles and oftentimes isn't very mobilized or specifically clear. But thirdly, I think there's just irrational directing anger towards the solution. These individuals perceive it to be close to their identity. They believe it is their moral obligation to be doing this and be critiquing them. But it means their anger is something that is harder to be actively quelled and be able to move towards rational discussion. But I would posit the nature of this left-wing criticism means it is not over till it's perfect, and any positive change that is being seen is seen as something that is just doing, like, I don't know, so like something that is just trying to quell the left exchange and something that is just tokenism. So even if you as an institution try to move towards the policies that you're changing, it is not seen as just, and so these criticisms continue to increase by criticizing them further and further in terms of actual change not being able to done. What this means then is that you as a movement have a small amount of reach, minimal amount of people who think you're legitimate, and the belief that nothing is ever able to be done. What does this manifest like? I think it just means you spread social media infographics about how they're just like leaving behind indigenous people, specifically highlighting certain stuff and issues in the thing. I don't think these are very well researched and backed up all. Oftentimes you see these things, you have minimum levels of education and capacity to even research or investigate, so you oftentimes just don't put forward the right amount of information, often spread around specific pieces of misinformation and harm towards these NGOs. But I think you specifically blow up and inflate the bad things that the NGOs have done. And I think this is potentially like stuff like unsubstantiated evidence, like I pointed out, but even just things that aren't particularly relevant to all the thing because you just want to critique them in any way you possibly can to decrease how people view them and see them as harmful institutions within the first place. But what about these NGOs and what they look like? I'll talk about the harms of that later. I think these NGOs are, one, already dealing with these issues pretty substantially well, and two, are not going to listen towards them. Number of reasons why. Firstly, Cyrus tells you a rich white person. OG, I think, challenges pretty well, but I would just also add another mechanism. Oftentimes people who are within liberal NGOs themselves are often people who have been benefactors of these movements. They've seen the harm towards them. They haven't received an abortion. They've been homeless themselves. They often go out of the way to volunteer and work towards them. So you're often someone who has been part of this oppressed group. If internationally exists to a such extent, I think they often have people from other minority groups within them. But secondly, you are just incredibly aware of this criticism inherently within the movement by nature of you being liberal. Ideologically, you're someone who's probably spent your time like reading Foucault, like reading Audre Lorde, people who are popular names within the liberal movement who advocate about intersectionality all the time. This means that you're probably someone who already believes to some extent in intersectionality, but this also means internally within your movement, you probably have people who do care about this and see it as useful. I want to note, even if say there's valid criticism, if at the point at which you as a leftist are likely to join these movements yourselves, you're less likely to be able to have this internal discussion of when you perceive this institution as immoral and inefficacious. Policy isn't changed via the media, it is changed in the boardroom. It is changed with who you assign as the product manager and what this product manager actually thinks for this to be a legitimate thing and the ways in which you're going to program their outreach programs. Business decisions are often made in these informal discussions of change where you talk about where your policy direction is going and how you want to change it going forward. Now when you have less of these individuals actively joining this movement and working for it themselves, seeing the positive and negative way up, then I think you're less likely to get a positive change within these institutions themselves. But thirdly, I think you have direct obligations towards shareholders inherently and for the purposes of why you set up this company. Oftentimes you've set up this established company for a specific purpose, granted donors by a specific reason. And yes, these people might be richer and might only care about one specific issue, may not care about black rights, but care about abortion. But I think they just reject, I think they either just don't care about intersectionality because they care about one issue and are donating you for a specific reason. But I honestly don't know why they have an obligation to work for everyone. I don't think OO has proved intersectionality even exists. Sure, it might impact other people, but I think there are just other people who are also impacted who are part of these minority groups. I just think if you're someone who cares and advocates for civil rights, who who advocates for bodily autonomy. You aren't someone who doesn't care about someone else's oppression, but I think you have made your own trade-off when you're formulating a policy and the sorts of policies you want to pursue. You look at what is able to be done, who is able to be marketed for, because you care about the utile outcomes of what you're actually positively able to provide towards people, rather than just the principle of what should be done. Go.
Are you claiming that there's a difference between left-wing criticism and internal criticism of the NGO? Most of the left-wing criticism comes from inside the NGO.
Yes, I am. I'm saying that if you have people who are probably little less like left-wing and ideologically motivated, still understand the reasons to why intersectionality could matter, who are internally within the institution and are willing to make the pragmatic trade-offs being within these institutions themselves, then I think you're far more likely to get better, efficacious movement in these things because they're able to actually get change rather than just like staying out of these movements entirely. What are the actual harms of this? I would honestly just posit the biggest harm for this is it's just a fucking waste of time for these NGOs to be able to deal with, right? It looks like you going out of your way to like donate someone, or like just like changing the ways in which you are advocating for specific policy, talking about it in a specific way. Maybe you do a specific level of tokenist policy to quell this citizen if it's actually meaningful. I think this just looks like politicians being able to change the extent to which they're able to understand this NGO within the first place. I think this also just means that the sort of criticism for these bad NGOs actively gets credited up more because specific left-wing criticism of these things drowns out these things in the first place. Why should we care about the majority and their ability to access these things? Note, even if it's only like I don't know, like a few £100,000 that are moving over, or like a few thousand quid that's moving over the line, this directly changes the ability of way in which for this NGO to interact and engage with the public, to carry out these resourceful goods. Note these NGOs often still work on a law, so any level of funding is a meaningful loss of funding towards them. One, I'm unsure why a black woman not accessing abortion matters more than a white woman not being able to access abortion. Oh, don't do the weighing for you. These are both people in times of need who need access to it. I'm literally unsure why someone in times of need matters more. But secondly, they're just more of the majority. The intuition pop I would use here is that if you have an obligation to be able to help someone who is drowning, who is closer towards you, and there's someone else who's drowning further away, I think it is within your obligation to maximize the people who you are able to save to the widest degree possible. And when you aren't able to do that, I think you're actively occurring a harm towards these people. Secondly, I think Discourse is just less important for you people to getting these civil rights and things in the first place. And thirdly, if politics is going to change, it's going to be short-termist, harming your capacity because you specifically promote poor people within these things. Closing government.
Our case works on two basic levels. Firstly, that when you internalize and adopt these narratives, it means that you have less efficacy in what you're able to do because there are direct trade-offs. Second of all, when you don't internalize it, you still have to address it, and there are direct and significant opportunity costs in terms of what you could do with your time. Maybe lots of the left-wing criticism is good and helpful. This is taking op at their best, particularly the CO case, but also the OO case. But even if this is true, we think less of it is good and useful than the other checking mechanisms that exist, and there's a direct trade-off in the time that you spend engaging with either the left-wing criticism or the other trade-offs or the other checking mechanisms that you get. The charitable read of this debate is that there are some groups that tend to provide bad criticism and others to provide good criticism. Let's work within this framework. First of all, rebuilding our case. What's OO's preemption? The first thing they say is that bad discourse reads itself out because there's criticism back at the bad discourse and the insane ideas go away. The problems with this are, one, given we frame that there's often lots of super disparate criticism, I think you genuinely don't have the capacity to deal with all of it because there are more people outside of an NGO criticizing it than there are inside of the NGO defending it. So I think that's just a really minimal number of people that you can allocate to this, particularly when you're probably stretched for resources because you are an NGO, you're not a profit-making organization, and so you probably have lots of people allocated to doing other important work as well. I think even external support from other actors who are supporting the NGO probably can't address every single possible criticism because it's the people who are most ideologically motivated to spend the most time online and shape discourse to the greatest extent. Secondly, though, even if you don't buy that, I think you still often have to comment on this criticism and address it, even if other groups are doing that too, which does take lots of time. Because even if some other people outside your NGO point out where there's no evidence that your staff member said a bunch of slurs and this is the allegation that was made, it still looks fucking suspicious if you don't address it. But thirdly, even if you don't buy that, even if the criticism does happen back, even if you do in the overall argument, you still lose people who do identify as intersectional leftists and buy out of your message and buy out of your NGO, and that's a problem because they want to be a good activist and you get fewer things like donations for the NGOs, etc. here. Then you get Eli's POI to Wardan saying that internal checking mechanisms are still left-wing mechanisms. Let's deal with this. Two issues with this. One, lots of the stuff that we talk about isn't criticism though. It's just advancements that you read about in the field and discourse around NGOs, like reading a paper that says another NGO did this thing well, which inspires you to do that same thing well, which you adopt. So I don't think that this is unique to criticism. But second of all, I don't think that utilitarianism, the idea of benefiting the most people, has to come from inherently left-wing criticism, because I don't think it's a left-wing idea. I think that trying to do the most good for the most people is a broadly universal and cross-spectrum idea. Right. I think that the left-wing criticism specifically, no thank you, is often criticism for not being intersectional enough, and saying that you should prioritize people from intersectional groups over people from majority groups, which I think is something that Opposition Bench actually fails to explain why you should do. Let's talk about why we think we beat Opposition Bench explicitly. The first thing I would note here is Wardan's way, right? Even if Op Bench helps intersectional groups more, this is at the expense of the basic groups that you were trying to help in the first place, and he explains why we care more about them because of basic utilitarianism. No thank you. We would be fine taking the trade-off of providing 20 fewer meals in an ethnic minority neighborhood if we can provide 100 more meals to a white neighborhood, because we think that these are still hungry people, these are still people who are potentially starving. CO and OO, I don't think have done a sufficient job to explain otherwise. Later, I think people suffering are equally deserving of benefit. But beyond this, the problem with OO is that they don't explain why you need, well enough, why you need to know what intersectionality is, and you don't know that otherwise in order to change things. Because what I think they say is you need to know what intersectionality is, and then you're inspired to change things, but they don't explain well enough why you need active left-wing criticism for that. Why do you have really, really good awareness already? It's already everything Wardan says, but it's also the fact that according to their own characterization, you're an educated liberal. You've gone to uni, you've read research about this, you spent time trying to understand the oppression faced by other groups, just like how OO can discuss issues even if they don't affect them directly, just like how we all as debaters probably understand this, and you as an NGO know more than an average debater about NGOs. Secondly, you're engaged in NGO spheres, you attend conferences, you read journals and recent research, you talk with the leaders of other NGOs because you want to be a good NGO, and so given that these ideas are present at least to some extent in some NGOs in the sphere, and someone knows about it, they spread throughout. This doesn't happen through criticism, it happens through compliments, saying, here's a thing that we've done really well, and you can adopt this thing, and that doesn't have to be criticism. But thirdly, you just see generic left-wing discourse about intersectionality as well, to corporations, to governments. If the CAs know about this, I think you as someone who runs an NGO that is about this thing probably also knows about it. They say you don't, and their two metrics are one, education, which we flipped, and two, having a super narrow focus. But I think insofar as you share methodology and intersect with other NGOs and interact with them, you engage with these other ideas to advance your cause further already. What's your POI?
You don't prove, though, that there's ever even frequently a direct opportunity cost. Every black person you help is not a white person left in the dust. We show that the changes are often easy win-wins. It's posting your abortion flyer in the men's bathroom too, or fair hiring. I think you have tunnel vision.
Nice. I like that. Okay, cool. The issue with this, though, is that I think that there is often an opportunity cost on two levels. I think one is the opportunity cost in terms of the time that you spend dealing with these issues, which means that you don't understand intersectional issues as well, which is how we will win on the intersectional groups, even if you do buy that they're more important. But the second thing that I would understand is that we've explained why specifically you often do the most utilitarian thing already without the criticism, and so the specific added benefit that you get from the criticism, from the left-wing criticism, is saying that you should prioritize these intersectional groups more, saying that why the benefit to a minority matters more than the benefit to a majority person, and so those are often the narratives that you internalize, and so you often end up doing the less utile thing to help someone from a more marginalized group, which is the opportunity cost, because sure, some of the basic examples that Cyrus says, like putting up a flyer, don't matter as much, but the important examples, providing a meal to someone, providing a bed to someone in a homeless shelter, the things that genuinely change people's lives to a greater extent, those are the ones where they do take money, where there is an opportunity cost. What are the implications of all this for the debate? You already get the vast majority of like good implications and good criticism, and what that would lead to, even without that left-wing criticism, and most of the extra criticism that happens is bad, but even if it's not, even if the additional criticism is good, this will also deal with CO here. I would note two things. One, the extra benefits that you get are likely to be super niche things, and that's why you didn't already understand it. From all the time that you spent engaging in NGO spheres, attending conferences, reading journals, etc. I think your awareness is very broad, so maybe you get some marginal benefits, but I think these are marginal. But second of all, these are drowned out at least to some extent. Even if some of the criticism is good and some is bad, you still have to spend more time on the bad stuff because it's the most defamatory to you. The necessity of spending time addressing the bad stuff means less time is spent elsewhere. Often that is taken directly away from the alternatives. An evening spent writing an Instagram apology post is an evening not spent meeting up with your friend who runs a different NGO and hearing about the scheme that they've just put into place that does really well. An afternoon spent stressing about the unsubstantiated rumours that you did something atrocious is an afternoon not spent at the conference discussing how NGOs can become more efficacious, which includes intersectional ideas. There is a direct trade-off. Even if lots of the additional criticism from the left-wing groups is good, we think less of it is good than the internal checking mechanisms and the discourse that you get within NGOs, and insofar as there is a direct trade-off, we win this clash. We also benefit intersectional groups more, but I don't think we have to. This is why your time matters. Our impacts are 1, more time and money spent addressing the core issue, helping more people. 2, on OP, you get time taken away from the better alternative ways that you can understand and address intersectionality instead. How do we beat catharsis? On the comparative, the people who are doing this criticism still care about the issues. They will still find a way to express that. Likely they target something else instead. Maybe it's policymakers, maybe it's a social group, etc. I think you probably get more catharsis from this because you're attacking the people who have put you into this situation, not the people who are trying to do something to help, even if it's imperfect. So I think we just watch out catharsis. Owen never explains why it has to be towards the NGOs for you to get this. It's not relevant in the debate. CG.
Ready? One question that really needs some clarity in this debate is what exactly is the left-wing nature of criticism? Because I think neither Gov teams actually really answer that. And it's an important question to answer, right? Because when I POI'd OG on what sort of criticism is legitimate in their eyes, they basically said whenever the NGO in question is being ineffective in dealing with the specific aim of their organization, which is then important to understand what exactly is the characteristic of the left-wing criticism or discourse that they are so opposed to from the outside or from the internal mechanism. Note, their answer here is also damning because when they say that the NGO is being ineffective in impacting the individuals that they're supposed to be impacting, that is precisely the push that the entire op bench has been talking about, i.e. that the specific issues that NGOs try to deal with impact multiple people across different identities with a linked chain. The definition clarification that the motion clarification gives as well is basically pointing out how these issues are linked within a chain, within different reasons within those chains, and then to tackle those issues, you need to basically tackle these links in and of themselves rather than viewing them as an abstract general body. This is an important distinction because CG keeps highlighting that the trade-off in this debate
is between a group of people versus another group of people. That's not what the trade-off in this debate necessarily is, because we're not talking about a general set of people being not impacted versus a minor group of people being impacted. The major impact in this debate is that there is an awareness about how the groups of people that you want to impact with your policy, with your NGO, have specific needs which you are aware of, which then you can target, which is something Philip exclusively explains to you. And I know Oo is nodding over here, and I think Oo does do a decent job of at least exemplifying, as well as explaining where the unawareness come from, but the specificity of the policy, but specifically in terms of what NGOs can targetedly do in these situations, is something that closing opposition exclusively explains. That's contribution one that weighs as opening opposition. But more importantly, highlighting this ineffective but also inconsistent definition of the criticism in and of itself basically makes most of OG and CG's case kind of toothless, because everything then is assumed on the idea that NGOs are doing their job absolutely perfectly. At least if you go by OG's definition in terms of what the criticism is supposed to be, because they don't sufficiently answer what kind of criticism that they're okay with. And if they're okay with any kind of criticism, then why does that criticism not fall into the same trap of all of the outside callouts, of all of the things in terms of internal fighting in and of itself? And this is where the nature of the discourse comes into play as a secondary question as well. Because Piotr basically says that this debate is about the uncharitable forms of discourse, which is basically people feel attacked, people feel that they're not being heard properly in and of itself. The question to ask here of the panel, and they need to note this down, this form of discourse is not exclusive to left-wing criticism. The right-wing or the conservatives have had a history of calling out any kind of liberal NGOs, and they engage in this kind of discourse in talking about how certain abortion right activists are basically committing murder, or how certain activists or how certain NGOs that are basically trying to, fight for criminal rights are essentially people who want to have a destabilization of law and order within the state. I think these kind of online discourses happen in status quo from conservatives anyway, but most of these criticisms on either a news cycle basis or even from the left-wing discourse perspective are essentially fringe in terms of how long they stay within the attention span of most of the individuals that OG and CG care about. This is again unique rebuttal, because this also minimizes the impact completely, because at the end of the day, the news cycles always will have something new to sensationalize on, but more importantly, for the people for whom the services of these NGOs actually matter, this is not necessarily an issue that's going to stay long in the memory in and of itself. For the worker, it doesn't necessarily matter, which O has already pointed it out, but for the people for whom these services are important, this doesn't necessarily matter on that level as well, because this is not seen as infighting. In fact, it's not even something that is seen as memorable. The fact that neither OG nor CG have been able to give one concrete example that has been able to stay in the memory of either forms of the media is essentially an indictment of that fact. So then we go into the idea of CG here about being a good NGO in and of itself, and how this internal calculus of criticism is going to be good. Here's the question on this one. Why is this mutually exclusive from any outside criticism that necessarily occurs? But more importantly, if the second part of their case applies, how is the internal criticism necessarily good in and of itself? I think CG tried to say that even if that criticism is supposed to be good, we can achieve it on their side, or on their side as well. But this is where the mutual exclusivity is never really highlighted, because as long as we agree with the idea that any kind of discourse that you need for criticism can both be internal and external, and it can be well-meaning, basically in the characterization of what Philip already gives out to you, then that kind of synergy between the internal mechanisms of what you basically glean from external sources essentially becomes characterized. More importantly, I think the examples that they give about what other NGOs are doing or what other NGOs are writing are essentially a form of that well-meaning criticism in form of the academic literature, because most academic literature is essentially a criticism of how things have been done in status quo or in the past. So at that point, that tenuous definition of what criticism is supposed to be is even more confused on CG. They're just ceding more and more and more ground to the opposition bench, particularly to CO. Lastly then, What exactly does an NGO do, and why exactly is it so important? They don't just raise issues, they don't just talk about issues, they fund resources. They basically provide tangible means of improving people's lives. The fact that these are tangible things that help people is important to be criticized, because it is a damning understanding if people think that a effort starting by individuals trying to improve people's lives is perfect and can't be criticized further. The people's efforts, or any kind of NGO being started, is done by individuals who have some means to be able to start that organization in the first place. The most destitute, the most marginalized, the most ignored of the society don't have that voice, which is why all of the individuals that Philip gives out to you in terms of who can essentially criticize and call out basically have an incentive and a mechanism to be able to make their voices heard. These individuals and the NGOs themselves do care about these peoples, which is why this criticism also leads to more meaningful change based on the exact cycle of the policies and the exact cycle of the narratives that matter to them. Maybe not all of it makes a difference, but it does more good than harm, because these NGOs then fundamentally improve.